like to talk a bit about why we study pop culture. I'm sitting here reviewing my notes for this talk and just reading from Bell Hook's seminal Teaching to Transgress. I have read her later books, especially the Teaching Critical Thinking. But this book really goes so deeply into the heart of what we're trying to do in teaching and empowering students. And so in this chapter, Embracing Change, I really think she says so many things that hit about what I'm about to speak about, but I'll just say this one where she starts. She says on page 41 in the chapter Embracing Change, an early chapter in the book. So she makes clear to students that they will have to speak up in the classroom. To hear each other, the sound of different voices, to listen to one another is an exercise in recognition. It also ensures that no student remains invisible in the classroom. And then she goes on to explain how in this transformed classroom that she spends books and books and books describing in different ways and how to achieve it in the transformed classroom, about how students having that voice, about students speaking up and having their knowledge and personhood recognized. I often find that it's difficult to express to my colleagues how this really looks like without being able to provide a specific example of how that plays out. And so it often starts, and I'll just show this through this example, with pop culture. So this is why we study pop culture, so that we can empower students with the knowledge and power of critical thinking. And so critical thinking, of course, this pop culture is an entryway. We could give them, as Bell Hook says in an interview, all this meta theory about critical thinking. But at the end of the day, if you say, well, did you see this movie? And did you look at the different ways that archetypes were used? Did you look at the different stereotypes were used? Did you look at the basic, did you look at the meta narratives of the story before you? And oftentimes, these were cued to students in different ways, but having no place to articulate them, they often don't have the opportunity to think them through or even see the value in what they know in their own critical perspective and what Bell Hooks calls in developing their own oppositional gaze. And this, I often acknowledge that as a person who is both genderqueer and Black and from the South, standing outside of the dominant normative patterns of being a Southern person made it very easy for me. I had to choose to flee or fight. And I, of course, chose to fight. And fight, of course, not with my fists, of course, I did that as a kid, but with the pen, with my mind, with strengthening, just like Ali said. And Ali, one of our homeboys, is much more of a hero to us, not only because of what he did in the ring, but also how he acted outside the ring. And so looking at and thinking about how people can think critically in their lives is so empowering. And it's empowering not only outside the classroom, but specifically within the classroom, where we look at just how we allow students to bring their own folk knowledge, their own what you know about the world into the classroom. And this is one of the easy ways that we can build activities around to get them to talk about the world that they know, this world that we're trying to teach them to engage with in healthy and responsible ways. So the realm of theoretical discourses that are important here, first and foremost being critical discourse analysis. This I provide for students as a broad umbrella of saying that you are not expected to enter the academy as an apolitical space, but one that we must act responsibly within, with the understanding that we will go on from this space, go on from the classroom to then therefore carry on those ethical democratic values that we're rehearsing in the classroom. And to do that, we also have the understanding that we are entering those spaces outside the classroom as agents of change, as people who are going to transform, because we are acknowledging that there's both the perpetuation of inequality in our world, but we also practice democracy within the classroom. And so to bring them together is where I think pop culture really has the power to transform many different disciplines. And just on that note, I'll give you the last the last contribution I'll use here from Bell Hooks this time. And she talks about this very notion of applying theory and practice, what we're ultimately trying to enable students to do, and why critical thinking is so crucial in the classroom. And she says, when she talks about shifting paradigms, so white students learning to think more critically about questions of race and racism may go home for the holidays and suddenly see their parents in a different light. They may recognize non-progressive thinking, racism, and so on, and it may hurt them that new ways of knowing may create estrangement where there was none. Of course, people, elsewhere she talks about Black students being alienated, particularly students who are quite using university to be upwardly mobile, going back to impoverished places where people aren't as upwardly mobile and spirited as they are, and having to negotiate that space, and then come back to the bourgeois classroom space and have to sort of code switch. And so she doesn't use that term code switch yet, but that's part of what she talks about when she describes even using the linguistics that students could bring to the classroom, and acknowledging that different vernacular is appropriate and accepted in the classroom as a form of generating and producing knowledge is this space, but equally that we don't treat those students as what Bell Hooks calls a native informant. You know, that lone person of color is representative of their ethnic, religious vernacular of their otherness. And one way I just thought I did this recently in the classroom is we were preparing for a student trip abroad. And we were talking about the different ways that students need to look out for each other. And one student said, we got each other's back. And I asked him to, really explain what that means, to articulate that vernacular into this formal classroom space. And so it was really facilitated a discussion on what we were expecting of them and how we could have sort of didactically said, you as students have to do this to look after each other. Well, it was much incorporating in the term, get each other's back on this trip. And they were able to articulate that. And that's another way that even the vernacular that's in pop culture can be brought into the classroom if we allow that space. Much of what we're talking about in popular culture circulates in media. So we are talking about the content itself, the media that talks about it, those spaces, particularly now social media is the space where we experience, see, participate, and produce content for popular culture, for what becomes, popular discourse. And so I always find it's very helpful to look at Chomsky's propaganda model of tracing power in media. So of course, you can talk about a Murdoch. But crucially, students will also be able to identify this huge irony in hip hop culture, in that it's ultra visible, and yet its radical roots are ultra invisible. So you see its hedonistic forms in its popular, in popular culture, but its counterculture roots they're not dead, but they're almost invisible to people outside of this, such that even the young people who participate in it may not even have the awareness of how to think about why they're counterculture, but it resonates with them. And so looking at propaganda, media as a form of propagandizing, really helps students to contextualize this. But crucially, in this point of power, this is where we start to talk about, well, what forms of power are there, and how can we look at and think about power itself? Because we see that media is a form of power, propaganda is used as a tool of power. We see the power, we start to talk about stereotypes. People often are aware of at least this kind of term. They see the power of stereotypes. So what is power then? French and Raven's 5 forms of power, now 6 bases of power. And this is where we take a pause to really look at what archetypes are and stereotypes are in popular culture. So I've hit them with enough theory about it and background enough, and sort of where the aim and goal of looking at this sort of otherness is. And then we hit them with exactly, we go there. Well, let's look at actual images that we see of ourselves in the popular world. One of the images I have are, 5 of, America's top divas. In full drama. Mariah, Madonna, Beyonce, What's So Shaky, Shakira. And you have all these fair-skinned women, blonde hair, big boobs, protruding out. And we talk about the beauty myth. we talk about how much pressure there is on looking a certain way, and how much this as a consumer market targets women to the extent of even crafting, women's bodies around a certain patriarchal gaze, and sort of introduce Hooke's patriarchal gaze alongside this undercurrent that we eventually get to, the oppositional gaze. I often find that looking at gender itself before we start to look at issues of race and class more acutely are really helpful. Me as a Black male teacher and gender cis, people often expect and hyper expect, sort of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to be quite anti-racist and quite anti-queer and these sorts of things. And I find that for me, it's easy to sort of ease into this, and also because it allows me as a male to own my own male privilege and to acknowledge that there is a role that I would have in talking about and speaking about sexism, even though my person would in some ways benefit, and in other ways, as I mentioned, being gender cis, quite victimized by sexist notions about who I am. So rather than sort of dive into dealing with those, and I tell students about my career path, but more so look at gender, because it's a basic way that we sort of think about our fundamental social divide. And then we start to look at gender in terms of the hero-heroine narrative. I think that will actually come first. And so, we look at the superheroes and how this idea of, man saving woman and the helplessness of women is a basic feminist critique that, though we don't think of women as helpless, it's perpetuated in virtually all throughout our pop culture, such that a film, not just about Superman or Batman or whomever, a superhero, but a film about a president. Now, I like to use Harrison Ford, Arnold Schwarzenegger as these kind of archetypical hero but normal characters, someone that we could almost aspire to be. So he'll be the president of the United States, goes out, commits all kinds of violence against all kinds of different people, guns, battles and this, that, and the other. And then at the end of the day, the whole story is, can I get back to my wife? And how many Hollywood stories are couched in this heterosexual narrative of man just has to do everything and he'll beat any man just so that he can get back to his wife. And so students really see this all around them, and they're able to contribute with fantastical ideas about how this narrative is perpetuated both in film, but also in music, and the imagery of music and the iconic music video, including, I would say, the most iconic music video, the one that defined the format, Michael Jackson's Thriller, where even he's, mocking, in a sense. We know he's mocking. It's like, this little, sissy Michael Jackson is actually, chasing around some girl in the forest. No, not really. But we know he's acting, and that's the beauty of why we love Michael Jackson, because he's portraying the narratives that we see. He's always echoing. I have a whole different lecture about Michael Jackson, but that's just a taste of it. The next stereotype that we look at, not the thug, but the Magic Negro. The Magic Negro character, of course, the Black character that appears out of nowhere, helps the white protagonist go from nowhere to everywhere, from zero to hero, and then magically disappears. The Legend of Bagger Vance, with the now infamous Will Smith, of course, he, in most of his movies now, just saves the world and sacrifices himself. And I sort of trace how this goes back decades, it's not a modern thing, and how we see it in contemporary film today. The image of the thug is out there, and that's so saturated, we're so saturated with it, especially through hip-hop culture. I always leave that to the end. But then next we look at this Sapphire character, Black women, and the best, I've never seen such a good dramatization of the Sapphire character as in, there's a clip of Mad TV's skit on Bewitched, and so there's the show Bewitched, where the white woman in the 60s who's a witch swears to live as immortal because her husband wants her to live as a normal mortal. But of course, the comedy skit is that, instead of following the show format, instead of becoming just normal, I'm going to use my powers to just save the day undercover. She turns into a black, diva. Oh, who you think you are, and she turns it around, and it's very interesting and intricate ways that it both confirms what the original show was about, but also calls into question both the stereotypes while using the stereotypes. And then I go on to fairness ads and looking at how stereotypes are used to assert different forms of power. Now, all through these stereotypes, we're looking at how different, again, using French and Raven's 6 forms of power, to look at how power is asserted in these different stereotypes. So, of course, we look at the powerlessness and the powerfulness of this woman character in this Bewitched skit, about why the happy housewife of the 60s was protruding herself for the patriarchal man and his class project. Of course, in Bewitched, the moral, all the stories were, oh, Sam, you can only use your powers if it's to save me, to get a client so we can earn some money and, keep this middle class lifestyle. And so it was much about that. And this skit manages to bring together all of this, but then also contrasting these stereotypes, or both stereotypes now, of black and white women and how disempowered the women are, but how actually empowered they are. But using this black woman to look at how disempowered she would be, even inappropriate in the scenario, but how she's used to, be the hero and turn everyone around and put the arrogant boss in his place, and all the ways we might, as modern people, see that archaic show, but looking at those patriarchal norms are helpful for us as extremes in the modern day. Why this all becomes useful is because now we've taken a sort of 360-degree look at how popular culture, how stereotypes in popular culture circulate around us, how these basic archetypes around, being saved and being the hero, basic archetypes that we find in mythology about how to deal with darkness, about how to deal with as the Western culture looks at it as the evil, as the sin, as this sort of externalized force, but Eastern culture more so says, and Buddhism is the practice of this, of looking at that as that darkness is not separated or even external, but is internal, something to be contended with and sort of acknowledged and lived with as a part of life. So looking at this Western culture and how these stereotypes circulate on another level, we could have a different conversation with students about how, the hero and the sun god are mythologies that are tied to even the story of, the story of Christ himself. But to get students to look at and to think critically about these issues also allows them to, at the end of the day, to look at and think critically in a business context. How is Apple omnipresent in our world? How does it use and assert power? Because consumerism, of course, is not sold through what the thing does or what the thing is, but the lifestyle that it brings to you. And that's what we see through both the fairness ads and the, bleaching your skin so you can become powerful and wealthy, but also the other stereotypes that form these stock characters in our popular narrative. It also calls into question media as an industry itself. Is it ethical? But then we can use those tools we've now used in popular culture to apply it to theory and other disciplines. And I teach in a business environment, so I would look at a company like Apple and say, well, how is this company so powerful? How does their narrative permeate every aspect of, look at a newspaper or an ad, or everything is sold through narratives, platforms that Apple has given us, including, somehow many of you might be watching this on an Apple product. It's certainly being recorded on one. But using popular culture to sharpen the tools of critical thinking, I think, is so empowering to students in both the way that it allows students to produce content for the classroom that is then we provide the tools and the theoretical basis for dissecting and critically analyzing the content that they produce. But then also acknowledging that they are people that interact in the world, that where these norms are thought about, applied. And so getting them to think creatively about what that actually means, to confront, to be that change agent, to be that bewitched if they need to use that magic, but in the real world. And that, I think, is our greatest responsibility as educators, the greatest gift that we can give to students, is that of critical thinking.